Welcome to YieldNerd, an educational show about how you can acquire and manage yield. Welcome, yield nerds. It is time for episode 5. We're going to be talking about the yield curve again because that is basically what we are going to be managing throughout this show. And we will then be applying it to agency bonds and understanding what an agency bond is. So in this episode, we'll cover first a little bit of a recap of what the yield curve is, what did we learn when we traded treasuries and so on. And then we're going to talk about GSEs, an acronym that is a mouthful and it contains an alphabet soup behind it. And we'll talk about what that is. We will then look at how the agency bonds are doing today, what kind of rates are available. We're going to discuss their tax implications, and finally, we're going to go buy a couple of agency bonds. So that is what episode 5 is all about. My usual disclaimers: I am not a wealth management advisor. I'm not selling you anything. I am here to educate you. It took me a long time to learn all of these by myself, and I thought I will save you time and give you this information. So, with that, let's talk about the yield curve as a simple concept. If I am going to ask for your money and return it 10 years later instead of 3 months later, would you not ask for a greater coupon payment? That is fundamentally the yield curve. You would expect it to be a straight line going up, meaning the longer I keep the money before I return the par value, the more the coupon rate would be. But we learned when we looked at the treasuries that that is not the case in some cases during some times, especially during the time that is indicative of a recession, where the United States government does not encourage you to keep money longer. The United States government says, hey, if you want to borrow for a greater period of time, I am not going to reward you. Short-term yield is greater than long-term yield, which is a head scratcher, but it happens as a precursor to recessions. So in this scenario, we are seeing that the highest yield is actually at or around the 1 year mark, and past that yield starts dropping. And what we are now going to do is look at an application of the same yield curve except for agency bonds. A quick reminder, treasuries are state and local tax free. So let's look at GSEs. The acronym GSE stands for Government Sponsored Entities. And before we dive into government sponsored entities, I thought I'd give a short history primer. And this goes back to the 1930s during the Great Depression, when the government tried to stimulate the economy from the depths of a really bad recession in all fronts of investment. The thought was that the first thing we need to shore up is our banking system. We need to make sure banks are available to lend. The second thing is we need home ownership as the basis of asset creation to be very, very steady and firm. Farms need to have easy access to credit, and utilities and the energy infrastructure needs to have a solid foundation. The thesis was that if the government were to step in and provide a good backbone for banks, homes, farms, and infrastructure, the economy would come out of depression. How did the government do that? The Treasury said, okay, we're going to print money, we're going to borrow to stimulate the economy, and then we're going to use essentially a distribution system if you were to compare it to manufacturing. The next step is we're going to channel a portion of the money that we printed specifically to support housing and specifically to support farming. From there on, we take that money and divvy it up into local investments. And in some cases, there may be local small businesses getting loans from local banks, or homes in local areas, in areas where the income of the individual may be in a lower tier. In other cases, it might be larger investments and larger tiers and larger banks. And banks would buy these loans and they would turn around and offer it to individuals, pardon me. And the role of the banks in this scenario is that the banks would take the money that has been brought to them, lend it to individuals, to corporations, and make it easier for them to employ people and generate profit. That in turn would generate additional infrastructure investments, because where there are banks and new businesses, there is a greater need for energy, and that would result in jobs and a greater economic impact, which then affects us, the citizens of the country, by giving us a greater economic status, more personal income, and more wealth. The net result of all of this, and I'm sorry for chasing you around the screen, is that the country would have prosperity, which would be reflected by a greater availability of money, additional tax revenue, and a greater stimulation of the economy. That, in effect, was the thesis that the government implemented during the Great Depression to much success. Then the question is, how does that translate into what is available today and what we can do? And therein lies the genesis of GSEs, or government sponsored entities. So, to explain a GSC, I'm going to use a very simple concept. Many of us, if you're old enough, have youngsters in the house, and when they want to go buy a car, they are not credit worthy yet, and so they need an adult to sponsor their car or their car loan. And in effect, what happens then is you are creating the ability for the car dealer to say, I wouldn't have loaned money to Sally, but now that you tell me, you, the parent, tell me that you are going to provide the backing, I'm going to have greater confidence in loaning to this young person. Now, loans are not given just to young people. In some cases, the older people in our family may need help as well. Or perhaps somebody needs a little bit of a nudge or a partnership. What I mean by that is maybe there's an investor club, it's a yield investor club, and the parent says, okay, I'm going to help you get started. I'm going to give you a little bit of startup capital. This is going to be a partnership between the young and the old, and you take care of it yourself. And the investment club sees that as an endorsement of sorts. And they say, well, if you got some startup capital from the parent, even though you by yourself may not be credit worthy, I'm going to give a little bit of trust in the fact that the relationship will help, and I'm going to accept you into the club, and I'm going to treat you as a lower risk. And these are all loose concepts that I'm using. They're not perfect analogies, but we're going to apply them as we understand the world of agencies. One way or the other, the trust of a bigger, more stable entity is being transferred either through a direct underwriting, a direct sponsorship, or an indirect public-private partnership to entities that then stimulate the economy. So GSCs are not the governments themselves, but they have a line of credit, they have a sponsorship, they have some kind of a partnership that makes them a better risk. So let's see how this could get applied. The Treasury is going to print money. The Treasury still borrows money. They then give it to a couple of entities: the Federal Housing Lending Bank, the Federal Farm Credit Bank. These, you may remember from our earlier discussion, are specific channels that are designed to make money available for housing and farms. They do not lend, they in turn give it to the community banks or the major banks, who are instructed to invest in the local economy and farms and businesses and housing. And then there is a second class of entities, which is the Freddie Mac and the Fannie Mae. These are the institutions that buy the loans. So they are kind of a processor. If you looked at this as a factory where some widgets are being made, which is the Treasury, the warehouse of that money that is being made is the FHLB and the FFCB in this example. The distribution vehicles or the trucks that drive the money to the community or the community banks and the major banks. The store where you go buy the widget is the Fannie Mae and the Freddie Mac. The grocery cart, which is, I'm just trying to simplify this to kind of bring it to a smaller and a smaller scale. The infrastructure that enables you to buy a lot of goods at one time is the grocery cart. That is the local investment, the energy infrastructure. And finally, on your dinner plate comes the food that has been cooked. That is your personal income and your wealth. And you then contribute to the prosperity of the nation, which enables the nation to reduce its debt, to offer more incentives, collect taxes from the wealth you created, and thereby go through this entire circle again. That, in effect, is what a government-sponsored entity is. The FHLB, the FFCB, the Fannie Mae, the Freddie Mac, the Ginnie Mae, all of these are government-sponsored entities. TVA stands for Tennessee Valley Authority, which is a public utility that was created right around the Depression era as well. So, moral of the story, in order for the country to come out of depression, there was an alphabet soup of sorts that was created: the FHLB, the Fannie Mae, the Freddie Mac, the FFCB, the TVA. All of these are entities that were created to make money supply available to the community and stimulate the economy and create a better outcome for all of us. So then the question is, if there was a yield curve for the Treasury, is there a yield curve for agency bonds? Of course there are. Let's understand what they are. I'm going to use Schwab. My usual disclaimers apply. I'm not endorsing Schwab. I'm awaiting logins to additional trading platforms so you can see how you can look at this everywhere. You may remember from previous discussions that if you want to look at fixed income and the yield curve, you would go to research. Once you're in research, you would then go to bonds and fixed income, and you would get the overview screen. Agency bonds are listed directly below treasuries, and that is what we are going to look at. All GSEs, the Fannie, the Freddie, and FHLB, FFCB, all of those are in one place. And so we're going to dive deeper into how to understand this area. And before we go even deeper, I thought I would illustrate the current September 23rd, 2022 agency bond yield curve. And you can see that this is more of a straight line than the Treasury. It doesn't have that inversion except in one area. When you're about in the 3-year area, for whatever reason, and again, this is what the market is saying, 4 years later, there is a lower rate available than 3 years later. And then it goes higher for the 5 and 10 years. And so there is an inversion in agency bonds as well, except it is at a longer duration. And remember this concept, and we're going to come back to this, because when we help construct the yield portfolio, we are going to overlay these yield curves so you can understand how to create your portfolio for yield accumulation and management. So here is what we have done. We have overlaid in red the Treasury yield curve, and you can see that pronounced inversion right around 18 months. And then we have shown the agency yield curve on top of it, and you can see how if your duration is between 18 months and approximately 3 years, and we'll talk about a couple of exceptions to this later, if your yield curve is longer than 18 months, it looks like agency bonds are fantastic alternatives that give higher yield. And I want to be very, very clear about this. The appearances are deceptive. I've shown here exactly the percentage difference between treasuries and agency bonds. And as you can see, in some cases, agency bonds give up to a 47% higher yield than treasuries as of this date. And the inversion shows how agency bonds and their advantage go from a 13% difference to only a 5% because of the inversion that happens. And so you may look at this and say, I know exactly what to do. I should buy every agency bond with a duration of 18 months or greater that I can get my hands on. Kumbaya. Life is not that simple. I'm going to leave this episode on that note and pick it up while I'm hoping you're at the edge of the seat wondering why that is not the case. Thank you for subscribing to Yield Nerd. Thank you for listening to Yield Nerd. a do-it-yourself show for yield accumulation and management.